There are all kinds of references calling the camp a ticking time bomb, the Guantanamo of the Middle East, ISIS University, other things that are all stigmatizing and dehumanizing the people who are there, while a good number of them did not choose that life, did not choose that location, and they are victims.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. After the Islamic State was largely defeated on the battlefields of northern Syria in 2019, thousands of fighters and their families were placed in detention facilities in the region. By far the largest of these detention camps is Al-Hol, which at its peak held over 70,000 people from several dozen countries. Today, there are over 50,000 people living in Al-Hol, which is essentially an open-air prison. The vast majority of people living there are children. My guest today, Sarhang Hamaseed, is Director of Middle East Programs at the United States Institute of Peace and is intimately involved with efforts to help repatriate families who are currently stranded in this prison camp. When we caught up, he recently returned from Iraq working on programs to support the reintegration of Iraqi families in Al-Hol. In our conversation, Sarhang Hamaseed explains why this festering prison camp in northern Syria is both a humanitarian and security crisis that deserves broader attention. We kick off discussing the history of Al-Hol before having a long conversation about efforts to reduce its population. I've been wanting to do an episode about Al-Hol for a while. This is one of those situations that I think kind of flies under the radar, but is very much both a humanitarian and security crisis that deserves wider attention and is something I think that the audience that congregates around Global Dispatches will be particularly keen to learn more about. So if you are listening to this contemporaneously, in the coming days, I will have a big announcement for you. I can't tell you what it is just yet. We're not quite ready to go public, but will very, very soon. To get this news as soon as it's available, please sign up for our newsletter at globaldispatches.org. I am really excited for this. All right, I'll tease it. It's a new podcast I'm launching, but I'll say no more. Go sign up for news at globaldispatches.org, and we'll let you know very, very soon. Now here is my conversation with Sarhang Hamaseed of the United States Institute of Peace. Sarhang, thank you so much for speaking with me. To kick off, can I have you explain the circumstances that led to Al-Hol becoming the kind of open-air prison that it is today?
Thank you for having me, and thank you for paying attention to this very important humanitarian security matter that Al-Hol represents. Al-Hol as a camp was established in the early 1990s to actually hold refugees and people who were escaping from Iraq after the 1991 invasion of Kuwait and the US-led coalition that pushed out Saddam and his army out of Kuwait. Then it came back to be reopened and receive Iraqis after the 2003 war, when Saddam was removed from power and the Ba'ath Party was taken out of power as a result of the US-led invasion. Then fast forward to after 2015 and onward, the fight against ISIS, it started to become a place for Iraqis escaping the fight with the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS as it's commonly referred to. And gradually it became a more visible problem set in March of 2019, when the last stronghold of ISIS was captured in Syria and in Baghuz, where tens of thousands of so-called ISIS families or people who have just moved along with the military campaign to a better place got stuck in Baghuz, and they were all moved to Al-Hol camp, pushing the population to about 73,000 people at its peak in 2019. So technically, it's called a camp, not a prison. And although people can't leave the camp, so they are kind of limited into the camp.
So essentially, the bulk of the population that is in Al Hol today, following the defeat of ISIS territorially in Syria, are both ISIS fighters, but presumably even greater number are the families of those fighters or other civilians that one way or another were caught up in the crossfire.
So technically, there shouldn't be fighters in the Al Hol camp. The fighters are detained, imprisoned in other facilities controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, which the United States is supporting to keep those facilities safe. So Al Hol, in theory, is supposed to be only civilians there, but it is the security of the camp over the years has been an issue. It is very much possible that fighters have infiltrated and managed to get into the camp. And there is a part of the camp called the annex that holds the foreign nationals. This is the part where the most extremist adherents of ISIS in the civilian population are focused and concentrated in the camp. And those have been the masterminds of killings inside the camp, and they have been trying to help families and individuals who are in the camp to break away. So technically, as I said, there shouldn't be fighters, but the camp is not fully controlled to vet every single person there. So it is possible that there are some armed actors there.
So, can you just briefly break down the demographics, as much as we know it, of the people in the camp today, both in terms of the numbers of foreigners as well as the number of children and spouses of the men who are there?
So, as of early May of 2024, the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS released some numbers. According to those numbers, there are 42,088 individuals in the camp. Of those, they estimate that 18,837 are Iraqis. Of the total population, they also estimate that 16,796 are Syrians, and they estimate that 6,455 are from other nationalities. At peak, it was estimated that some 60 nationalities were in the camp. Probably that number has become a little smaller than that. In terms of the mix of the population, mostly are women and children. Estimates have been that about half of the population at any given time, half of them were under the age of 12.
Presumably meaning a not insignificant number that were born into the camp.
Yes, I think probably more than 5,000 or more were born in the camp. So they did not choose to be in Al Hol. They did not choose their parents. They did not choose the circumstances that they're under in. And that is what makes Al Hol a tricky situation. Do you consider those victims or do you consider those guilty? If you're a child born there, you did not choose these circumstances, then you're a victim. If you're a woman who did not choose your husband and you're forced into marriage and you're forced to get into that situation, then again, that is a situation of being a victim. But that is not the image that the media and a lot of reporting has portrayed the camp. There are all kinds of references calling the camp a ticking time bomb, the Guantanamo of the Middle East, ISIS University, other things that are all stigmatizing and dehumanizing the people who are there, while a good number of them did not choose that life, did not choose that location, and they are victims.
What are the humanitarian conditions in the camp? Like, who is providing humanitarian aid? Is there adequate shelter, food, and medicine? Are like the basics of humanitarian relief provided in one way or another?
There's been a process of evolution in terms of the quality of what was provided at the camp in terms of shelter, in terms of basic services. It was pretty bad in 2019 when all of a sudden the capacity of the camp significantly increased, getting the tens of thousands coming out of Baghuz. So over the years, there has been improvements where The shelters have been improved to a certain degree, not fully, and the perimeter of the camp has been secured better because there has been attempts at breaks, and also there were crimes happening inside the camp. There has been an increase in social programming that was provided, whether it is education or humanitarian assistance. However, those remain below what the international standards are aspiring for. And the goal of the international community, which is providing this assistance through different organizations, international organizations and local organizations inside Al Hol camp and in the surrounding areas, but also throughout the process of people who have been exiting. So, international organizations play a role in providing some services within the camp as the people who exit the camp in that transitional stage, and then as they try to reintegrate those people into the communities for those who are innocent and not found to be guilty by the judicial system of the countries that they return to.
So this camp is in Syrian territory that's controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, which is a US backed, mostly Kurdish militia that was very effective in defeating ISIS. I guess two questions. First, what's the nature of SDF's management of this camp? I mean, they're not letting people in and out as they please. So presumably they're keeping a fairly tight grip on things. And second, given that the SDF does receive the support of the United States, does the US bear any special responsibility for what happens to people in this camp?
So the SDF is providing two types of security, one to the perimeter of the camp and second inside the camp. And for that, they receive some support from the United States to enforce the perimeter and provide security inside the camp. But this is a complex and somewhat unprecedented challenge for looking at it from the prism that a non state actor, the Syrian Democratic Forces, is the force and the authority managing the camp. Second, that this is located in northeast Syria, where it is a theater that five armies have been active in that space directly or through proxies. Those five armies being the United States and the coalition, Turkey, Russia, Israel, doing strikes in Syria, but not necessarily in that part, the Syrian regime itself, the Iranians. So a mix of actors there. It makes it quite unique in terms of an operational circumstances. International organizations and local organizations have actually been the service providers inside the camp and have been the conduit for international support to manage this complex portfolio. So depending on whose perspective you look at the situation, if you ask the SDF and the Syrians, they say the bulk of the population here is not from Syria, not from their area. So the international community has a responsibility in helping them fix this problem set. And if you look at it from the perspective of the international community, it has been more complex because they have nationals in the camp, but they have not been able to return, and they have been reluctant to return because there is a general thinking of those people could be an ideological threat, a terrorist threat. They could be responsible and they cannot hold them accountable. So if you bring them back to countries where you apply due process, if you don't have evidence, sufficient evidence to prosecute those people, then you'll have to set them free. And if you set them free, as I said, there is a concern about what ideology they may hold, and they become active ISIS members in the future. So it's a complex situation in terms of who really holds responsibility and who do you hold responsible for fixing this problem set. So it's a challenge that, if you look at it from a glass half full picture, from 73,000 at peak to about 42,000 now, it's progress where some 30 plus thousand have left the camp to different countries. But if you look at it from a vulnerability standpoint, this is a slow process of exiting the camp, and northeast Syria is a vulnerable place. Should the US troops, who are about 900, withdraw from that part, that region may collapse. That may set these people free, go at large, and you don't know what will happen to them. So it's a complex one.
I'm glad you brought up the fact that indeed, there have been tens of thousands of people who have been repatriated in one way or another. Can you just describe that process of repatriation? How does it work? Because I know it's an ongoing issue and it's an ongoing process. So, how is it that families who were once stuck in hellhole somehow make it back to their country of origin?
The process and the scale really differs by country, but in all of them, you can imagine a couple of key steps. One is a security verification that these people have not been ISIS fighters, therefore, there are not arrest warrants for them. I'm talking about the people who are in Al Hol. And then once you do the security screening, then there is a transitional stage of rehabilitation, which again varies from country to country. And then third, there is the process of reintegration back into their own community or some sort of a community. The Iraqis and the Central Asian countries probably have the more established rehabilitation programs. If we take Iraq as an example, that it has established what is called Jad'a Rehabilitation Center south of the city of Mosul in the north of the country. So Iraqis leaving Al Hol are vetted by the Iraqi security forces, and they come back in batches. Each batch could vary between 90 to 150 to close to 200 families. They go and they are placed in this Jad'a Rehabilitation Center. Different organizations support a rehabilitation program, so engaging the children, the adolescents, and the adults to check their health, to provide some psychosocial support, but also a degree of observation occurs to see if they are showing radical behavior and if they could be a risk to society. Depending on their status, there's an interagency psychological cell, as they call it in Iraq, that interviews these people and determines over time, between 3 months to 6 months, if they can exit the camp and go back to their community of origin. And as a result of this process, so far, about 9,000 Iraqis have left Al Hol camp to Jeddah and processed through Jeddah. Of those 9,000, about 6,000 have left Jeddah back to their communities, and about 3,000 remain there. It was estimated that the first 8 to 9,000 will be the easier cases because these are mostly the children, the elderly, those who are sick, and they would be expedited on a humanitarian basis. But there was the expectation that after you cross the 8,000 mark, the remaining will be more difficult cases who may still harbor ISIS ideology, or at least extremist ideology. And we are starting to see that manifest in the most recent batches. And that is a challenge, not just for the Iraqis, but for the other countries, in terms of how do you deal with this concern about extremist ideology. Communities tend to expect, and some security officials tend to expect, that you have to do a process of de radicalization, then get these people out. But experts in the area of de radicalization would tell you, globally looking at this problem set, de radicalization, basically removing ideology from a person, is extremely hard and takes time, and the effectiveness of it is not always promising. However, there is a concept of disengagement from violence, which is more practical, more measurable, and more attainable. And that is where many of the experts are starting to shift the attention of these countries to focus on disengagement from violence. And in that space, if I may, with this last comment, USIP has developed an action guide that is looking at this issue from three perspectives: from the perspectives of the individual, from the perspective of society, and from perspective of the institutions. It's called RISE. It's available on the USIP website for those who are interested in digging deeper into this issue. And we have started to expose the Iraqis, train the Iraqis on this guide to help them through this process.
And you were just in Iraq doing just that. I'm curious to learn if in your recent trip to Iraq working on this very issue, I don't know if there are any like anecdotes or stories that you might share that help illustrate just how thorny of a challenge this process of repatriation is.
So, communities of return to which you expect those people from Al Hol to return, and this is more complex in Iraq and Syria than any other place, because many of the families come from communities who have faced the destruction that ISIS left behind. If you're coming from Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, or France, or somewhere else, this is not where ISIS was governing and holding territory and holding population and destroying places. So, therefore, the return to those communities in Iraq and Syria is more difficult. So, there is communal and institutional opposition to return. And as USIP, the U.S. Institute of Peace, we have been working for the past couple of years with both the government of Iraq and the communities in, say, Anbar province in the west of Iraq, which is home to the largest number of Iraqis in Al Hol camp. At the beginning, when we started approaching the community, they were saying everybody in Al Hol is ISIS. These are terrorists. These are dangers. So they cannot come back because they are danger. These people cannot come back because they are guilty. They should be held accountable. But gradually, through a dialogue process that we brought the community together, and then the community with the security actors in the government of Iraq, the National Security Advisory, the National Security Service, the Ministry of Migration and Displacement, three key entities working on this process, we started a process to help destigmatize the innocent people who are stuck in Al Hol. When the security personnel explained that there are a large number of children who were born there, that started to change the perspective of the community. When they started to explain the vetting process, security vetting process that the Iraqi security forces do, that started to help change the perspective of the community. So we were able, through a process of dialogue, problem solving dialogue, to transform the opposition of the community to non objection to return, to supporting return, to now actual collaboration. An example of that collaboration is where the tribal leaders in Western Anbar, for example, in Qa'im, for example, are giving names of people from their own tribes who are in Al Hol to the government of Iraq, saying, "We will be willing to work. We'll be willing to work with you to get those people home." And as a result of that collaboration, already some people have returned from Al Hol to Western Anbar. The second area of collaboration is we facilitated with our Iraqi government partners for tribal leaders, community leaders to go to the Jad'a Rehabilitation Center and see for themselves and engage with the returnees and get a sense of these are not wedded into the ideology. They're trying to have a shot at life. And then the tribal leaders started to provide social sponsorship for those people in Jeddah Center for the government to feel comfortable and get them back to the community. So the best viable path for these people is to really get back to their communities and have a proper shot at life rather than remain in isolation in Al Hol camp where they could be exposed to ISIS ideology, where hatred could grow and they could be vulnerable to ISIS and the like in the future.
So I have to imagine that as opposed to, say, Iraq, where, as you describe it, reintegration requires like a whole suite of social services and just like social change on the part of the receiving communities. That here in the United States, and I presume there must have been at least some Americans from Al Hol that have been repatriated, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm curious to learn what that process looks like, getting Americans who are stuck in Al Hol back to the United States, and what role, say, the Justice Department has to play in all this vetting potential criminal activity.
So most of my focus, my line of work is focused on the Iraqis and the Syrians. To my knowledge and from what I have read about is that the US has returned repatriated Americans who have been in northeast Syria, including in Al Hol. And I think the most recent I have read about was earlier this month where 11 Americans were repatriated. We do not work on the domestic side of this issue, so I'm not knowledgeable about that. But definitely, you would imagine that there is a process, again, of vetting and going through a judicial process for those who would be accused. The issue of justice, a very complicated one, whether you look at it from an American perspective, for Americans who have been in a hole, or Europeans, or Central Asians, or the Iraqis and the Syrians. And that is the most complex part. There is the legal expectations on proceedings, but in the context of Iraq and Syria, we know that there is also a societal expectation about what justice is. And these people do carry a sort of a stigma in a big society like in the United States. If the US brings back dozens of people, the system has the rigor and the capacity to handle that small number of cases, and the society and the institutions have that ability to deal with this. But when you have tens of thousands, and as in the case of Syria and Iraq, it is a much more complex situation to unpack the aspects of justice.
So, lastly, do you expect that Al Hol will mostly be emptied of its population at some point in the next, I don't know, few years?
Well, the process of trying to empty Al Hol has been relatively slow, but also this is because it's a very complex situation. I mean, this year, next month, we will be marking the 10-year anniversary of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, then leader of ISIS, declaring the caliphate in Mosul. And during my visit, I had the opportunity last week to actually go to the same place where he declared the caliphate and the Islamic State. You can see that the society and the community has been rebuilding. So the destruction that this terrorist organization brought was big, displacing some 6 million Iraqis, displacing probably about a similar number of people in Syria. In Syria, it's more complex because there's a fight with the Syrian regime. So if we measure by the gravity and the danger of the problem set that we are dealing with, the process has been relatively slow. And projecting that into the future, there doesn't seem to be a path to significant progress, accelerate this to say, okay, we will resolve this in a year or two if it goes at the current pace. However, there are some looming dangers that are out there. So if northeast Syria collapses, for example, as I said, if US troops who are there supporting the SDF withdraw, the Syrian regime, the Iranian backed proxies, Turkey, a NATO ally, the Russians may make a move on taking the SDF on, and the SDF will be trying to defend itself and its focus on the people in Al Hol and the close to 10,000 detainees, ISIS fighters that they hold, will go away, and that may replenish the ranks of ISIS and the like in the future. So that's why the focus of the international community has to remain on Al Hol as a camp, on northeast Syria to remain stable as the process to empty the camp continues, and supporting countries like Iraq and others who are repatriating will be key to prevent this emerging as a next iteration of ISIS. Having said that, there is a large number of people in Al Hol. It may get to a place where countries will have to make exceptional, difficult decisions that their current laws and systems may not be set up to deal with returning those people and finding a way, updating laws, updating procedures for dealing with them. Otherwise, a large number may be not possible to repatriate, and therefore leaving them to vulnerability. And from all the cases that I have seen in Iraq and Syria and other places, the vast majority of these people do seek a better life. They did not choose to be in that situation. So it is important to help them with documentation, with the rehabilitation and psychosocial support necessary. But at the same time, supporting the communities to which they return is also key, because victims of ISIS say the international community is prioritizing supporting ISIS families rather than the communities and the victims. So there is a challenging debate there that continues to need attention and work.
Sarhang, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.